Bolt is a ride-hailing company, just like Uber. You can book a taxi through them. Now you can also rent an electric scooter or have your groceries or your takeout order delivered. You can even book a rental car through them. And Bolt is mainly competing with Uber in Africa and in Europe. There are a couple of things that stood out to me about Bolt and Markus Villig when I started reporting on this story. Markus was unusually young when he started this company. He was only 19 years old. So what I saw in Markus Villig and Bolt was something of a sort of David and Goliath story. You have a much smaller startup and a young founder going head to head against a much larger, a much better resourced American rival in the form of Uber. Uber also play very, very tough. We're seeing Markus and Bolt at times winning despite the odds being stacked against them.
Starting any business is hard, but it's especially hard if you're starting as a 19-year-old kid in a small country like Estonia with very limited experience and funding. So the first months were brutal. I was coding the app myself during the summer. I was going on the streets of Tallinn, signing up taxi drivers one by one. 90% of them immediately said, "Get out of my car, you're just a young kid, what are you going to offer me? It makes no sense." So it was very, very tough. And it was just persistence and very hard work that got us to where we are today.
So Bolt has grown very quickly in recent years and to date has raised $1.8 billion from venture capitalists. At its last round, last year, that valued the company at $8.3 billion. But when we look at corporate filings for 2021, we can see that they generated around $570 million in revenue. How does that compare to Lyft or Uber? On a revenue basis, that means that Bolt is around 5 times smaller than Lyft or around 50 times smaller than Uber. Markus Villig grew up in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. It's a small European country on the Baltic Sea in northeastern Europe. He founded this business right out of high school. So he had a few entrepreneurial ventures beforehand. He was web designing and he had started a small sort of ed tech app. Kind of quickly realized it'd be very difficult to scale that and sort of started looking around for sort of new ideas, new opportunities. And I think a big inspiration was Skype. Skype was Estonia's kind of pioneering unicorn startup that created a pre-Zoom online video and online call-in software that ended up being acquired by Microsoft. Several of his early investors came through Skype, and his older brother Martin, who helped co-found the business, had also worked at Skype as well.
Estonia actually has an interesting background where, due to the Russian occupation for 50 years, all entrepreneurship was outlawed. So nobody could start the business. And that was the environment I was first growing up in. But also, of course, as soon as the occupation ended and Estonia gained its independence, everybody wanted to start something new. So actually starting a company seemed like a very popular, new, trendy thing to do. And what also happened was there was no other big companies to join because the economy was so new. So it wasn't like you could go and join a large corporation. What many young people exactly wanted to do was start their own business. So it was actually a pretty natural environment for me to grow up wanting to be like that as well.
Markus talks about having been in to see many of the kind of leading venture capitalists across Europe and beyond, and was met with the same answer: no thank you. Investors were intrigued by him and what he built, but when they were looking at the opportunity of this very young founder from this very small country to build a product that could compete with Uber, which had already raised over $1 billion, investors were not optimistic about his prospects. As a result of that, Markus had to learn to do things his own way on a very small budget. This meant that Markus and Bolt had to find new ways to grow and had to find smart solutions to do that and to beat Uber. Some of the examples would be looking at Africa, where Bolt was very quick to offer cash payments. This meant that you could book a taxi through the Bolt app, and instead of making a payment via Apple Pay or with a card, you would hand your driver cash and the driver would settle up with Bolt at the end of the day or at the end of the week. This may sound like a small thing, but around 25% of people in South Africa don't have access to a bank account or credit card, and that's even higher in other parts of Africa where Bolt operates.
I'd say the hardest part of our journey so far were the first 5 years, because we were barely able to raise any funding at all. We managed to raise about 1 million euros and we built the company into more than 10 countries with that limited amount of funding, while our competitors were raising more money than any company in the history of technology. So we were completely outspent by all these other players, and the only way we could succeed was by being smarter. So we were really focused on making sure that the team is very focused on frugality, and we count really the impact of every euro that we spend.
It's a common playbook for startups in Europe that as soon as you start to build some traction, you should go to the US, which is the largest possible market. However, Markus was relying on his own data there. He started looking at the stats and saw that the greatest possible potential was actually in Africa, specifically in South Africa, rather than the US. He also knew that he would face less competition there than he would do where he had to go head-to-head with Uber or Lyft in the US market.
You need to expand only to the cities where you can actually offer something better than the incumbents do. Otherwise, you're just generating no value there. So we realized very early on that Central and Eastern Europe was underserved. Other platforms didn't really understand the local customer as well as we did. And that translated into many things. For example, local payment methods. They didn't work with all the drivers in these markets. They didn't necessarily focus on safety and some other aspects that were important here.
After years of running Bolt on a very tight budget, Markus was able, in the pandemic, to raise some really large sums of money from investors. That supercharged the growth of Bolt and helped it expand into new areas like scooters, like food delivery, like groceries, and even offering rental cars. That's been really expensive. E-scooters are a tough business though. Investors around the world have invested around $5 billion into startups like Bird, but many of them still don't turn a profit and are aggressively burning money.
Most companies can barely build one product that reaches millions of customers, and even less companies are able to actually build multiple products that ever work really well. So we were always very conscious that we don't want to expand into products that are not centered around our core mission. But with electric scooters, we realized very early on that there's many synergies that we can benefit from by having the leading ride-hailing service in a city and by also having the leading scooter sharing service in a city. Because it's largely the same customers anyway. So we don't need to spend nearly as much money on marketing to acquire those customers, but we can take that money that other companies spend on marketing and actually invest that into having a better product and cheaper prices. Bolt's mission from day one has been that we want to build better cities, and we believe the best way to do that is to replace private cars. So it's never been that we only want to be a ride-hailing company. I don't even have a driver's license. So for me, it was always how do we expand the product set so we can truly replace the private car? And electric scooters were the next obvious place for us to expand into because most of the trips in cities are short, and electric scooters are one of the best ways to replace those trips.
Ride-hailing is a tough business. It's hard to make money here with very tight margins. Bolt has got a lot bigger, but the business also burnt through $600 million in 2021. And investors will be watching Markus's and Bolt's numbers very closely, but also Uber and Lyft, which have still yet to turn an annual profit.
Our mission is to make cities better by replacing private cars. And we think that we're truly at just the very early stages of that. We already have more than 100 million customers across Europe and Africa. But when you look at the potential, then we think there's more than 1 billion people that we can address over these two continents over the next 10 years to come.